Well, I appreciate being referred to as a truth teller. Let me tell one truth at the very beginning. It took y'all a long-ass time to get me to Eastern, man. I have been coming. It's not your fault. Somebody said sorry. Unless you've been here for 20 years. You tried though. You've been trying, so it's not on you. It's some of these other folk. I don't know. Right? 20 years been coming to Washington State. I almost came here a couple different times and then it didn't happen. I've been to every other four-year college in the state, half of the community colleges. Now I've been here. So I appreciate it. And I appreciate the opportunity to spend some time with you. I also want to say thank you for that very kind introduction. It is an honor and a privilege, and I don't just mean a white one, like a general privilege. I mean, it's a white one too, but you know, it's more than that. To be even put in the same paragraph, let alone the same sort of thought bubble as Dr. King and Malcolm X and Angela Davis and Cornel West. And so I take that very, very seriously. And it's an important tradition to be able to uphold and to connect to. Having said that, though, I want to say before I get into the substance of my remarks today, that the truths that I tell are not mine alone. And it's very important to acknowledge that, particularly because, in case you hadn't figured it out yet, there's at least one relatively obvious and one might even say glaring difference between me, Malcolm X, Dr. King, Angela Davis, and Cornel West. There are several of them, all right, but that one that you're thinking of and that I'm thinking of is perhaps the biggest, and that is to say that as a white man doing this work, I think it's really particularly important for me and any other white person, particularly white men, but white folks generally, when we speak the truth about institutional racism and white supremacy, white privilege, all of these subjects that I'll discuss today, that we are clear that the truths that we speak and the wisdom that we try to bring to our work is first and foremost black and brown wisdom. It is the wisdom of peoples of color that has been shared with us and that we, fortunately, have been open to hearing. And until and unless white Americans come as a group to the place where we are open to hearing that, none of us are going to be free. And that is to say, that as kind as it is of you to be here and as wonderful as it is to be able to look out and see an audience this size for any presentation that I give, and I think any speaker would feel the same, we are not truly liberated as a people until a person of color can stand on this stage, give the very same talk that I'm about to give, and know ahead of time that they will have a similar crowd that is similarly engaged and similarly enthused, you see. My mama would like you to think that the reason I'm here is that I'm just that damn bright. But I know it's not that. There are a lot of folks every bit as smart, every bit as capable, better writers, just as good or better speakers. But I'm here, and I take that privilege very seriously, and I intend to dispense with that and to use that, hopefully, in a responsible and accountable way. So there's that. So here's the thing. We're in this sort of odd moment right now as a country. We're always in these, but we're in a particular one now. We're in this somewhat commemorative space where we're doing a lot of backward looking, right? Very selective backward looking, but backward looking. And what I mean by this is, really apparent if you look around. We are, after all, this year, commemorating the 50th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act, the Selma to Montgomery March. So if you haven't seen the film, you should. It's a fabulous film. And that film and the discussion around the film Selma is taking us back in time to this really seminal moment, this critical moment in the civil rights struggle of our country. Last year we were in a commemorative mode too because it was 50-year anniversary of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And the year before that, it was the 50th anniversary of the Birmingham campaign, the bombing of the 16th Street Church in Birmingham, Bull Connor turning his tanks in Birmingham on the black folks of that city, the murder of Medgar Evers in his driveway in Jackson, Mississippi, George Wallace standing in the schoolhouse door at the University of Alabama saying segregation today, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever. In other words, for the last couple of years, we have been in this place where we're doing a lot of commemorating, right? And on the one hand, that's important. On the one hand, it's valuable, right? It's important that we look back and that we count our victories and that we acknowledge our victories, and the Civil Rights Act was certainly one of those. The Voting Rights Act was one of those. The March on Washington, which was 50 years ago, 2 years ago, right, is one of those. All of those moments, very critical that we remember them. Too many folks fought and too many folks died not to. However, I want to suggest there's also a danger in commemoration. There are a couple of them. And we need to be equally mindful of those, because sometimes when we do the commemoration thing, we get stuck in a historical time period, right? Or we get stuck in this backward-looking glance and we're not looking forward. We're not looking at the work that remains to be done. There are three principal problems with this commemorative mode I want to address today so we can talk about what we need to be doing now. The first problem is that when we commemorate our history, we don't actually do it accurately anyway, do we? I mean, we don't really remember truthfully. So we do commemoration, but we do it very selectively, only the parts that make us feel good. And we know this is true because just 2 weeks ago it was, I believe, 2.5 weeks ago, the president went in front of the National Prayer Breakfast, right, and made an entirely innocuous but historically irrefutable argument. He made the point that it is not merely ISIS and certain extremists within the orbit of Islam who hijack religion to justify their deeds, that indeed in our own country, Christianity has been used for that same purpose. And we could just as easily say that Judaism has been used for that purpose and Hinduism has been used for that purpose, that all faith traditions have been misused and misapplied. He made this statement to try to suggest that even as we condemn the brutality of ISIS abroad, we do not have the right to be smug about the way in which that faith is used to justify murder, decapitation, killing, and terrorism, because we have our own history. And you would have thought that the President of the United States had called everybody's mama a name. Even though this statement is not rebuttable, listen to me. There is no rebuttal to what he said. There is no other side to what he said. What he said is not arguable. It is not up for discussion. It is simply true. Every horror that was done to peoples of color on this land was done in the name of Jesus. Know that. Every single one of them. Whether we're talking about the lynchings of mostly African American folk, 4,000 on the record, but actually if you go back and you look at the congressional record or the equivalent of that in the years following the Civil War, in the first 10 years when the records weren't being kept as clearly, there are references in there to over 10,000 extrajudicial murders of black folks in the South in just the first few years after the war. So no doubt the number is bigger than 4,000. Make no mistake, all the folks who did that thought they were acting as good Christians. Even as they advertised these lynchings, this wasn't just two guys with a rope in a tree pulling somebody out of a jail and hanging them. Lynching was advertised in newspapers as Negro barbecues. They would have picnics. They would bring chicken salad and sweet tea and lemonade and sit out under the stars as the bodies swung in the trees, and they would cut off body parts and sell them as souvenirs and burn the bodies with blowtorches after they were dead and take postcards of them and trade them like baseball cards are traded today. Christians did that. And they did it in the name of their God. So I don't want to hear any lectures about ISIS as some unique evil on the planet, because we have been there and we have done that. And by the same token, when Colonel Chivington marched in and killed Arapaho and Cheyenne non-combatants at Sand Creek 150 years ago last year, he, a Methodist minister, I should point out, acting in the name of God, slaughtering non-combatants, 2/3 of them women and children, indigenous peoples, and he said this. He said, "I have come to kill Indians and believe it is right and honorable to use any means under God's heaven to kill Indians, kill and scalp all, big and little, because nits make lice." He did this in the name of God. He prayed before he did it. He prayed after he did it. He was a Methodist minister, a man of the cloth, a Christian, at least by his own claim. So once again, we don't have to look to the other side of the world and to someone else's faith to recognize how the name and the purpose of God can be twisted for inhumane and ungodly ends. When the president said that, the conservative blogosphere exploded. Rudy Giuliani decided he clearly doesn't love America, because Rudy Giuliani knows so much about loving America. He said the president wasn't raised like the rest of us. Well, that's true. He wasn't raised by a mafia enforcer like Rudy Giuliani. whose father did time in prison for being a mobster and who dodged the draft, as did his uncles, as did Rudy Giuliani. That's true. Barack Obama didn't do any of that. That's totally true. So I guess Rudy Giuliani sort of has a point, just not the one he was intending to make, right? So that's the first problem with commemoration. We don't really remember accurately. We just remember the good stuff, and then the bad stuff, we want to act like we don't bring that up. So we don't bring up the Sand Creek Massacre. And we don't bring up the lynching of black Americans. Or we do bring it up, and folks say, well, now, why can't we just leave that in the past, you know? People need to move on. Well, what the hell? That's what history is the past, by definition. Why you take a history class then? What the hell you think July 4th is? Setting off fireworks is some really old shit. Like, we didn't break away from the British last Wednesday. That happened a really long ass time ago, but we're still eating apple pie, setting off fireworks every July 4th, wearing red, white, and blue, because that's a great wardrobe palette, right? Big I Heart the USA buttons on our hats. Yeah, we still do that. See, we love the past. We as a country love the past more than any country, as long as it's a past that venerates us and makes us feel good. We just don't want to deal with the ugly. But you don't get to select your history. You don't get to select the parts that you remember and the parts that were good versus the parts that were bad. You got to deal with all of it. That's what people who really love the country say. I love my children. That doesn't mean I don't criticize them. Right? Love doesn't mean like I don't let my kids just get away with anything. Like, oh, it's okay that you broke that. You know, it's totally cool that you didn't do your homework. It's completely fine that you stayed up all night, you know, texting your friends or what. No, it's not okay. And I correct them. That doesn't mean I don't love them. The same is true about a country, about a nation, about a culture. This idea that commemoration means dishonesty, because that's what we've turned it into, needs to be challenged. The second problem with commemoration, it's not just that. That may be the smallest of the three. The second problem with commemoration is that when we're looking backwards, sometimes we don't recognize that there's a road ahead of us that still needs to be walked. Because we're so busy looking back, and when we look back and we're looking at our victories and we're counting them up and we're tallying them, right? We're looking at that and we're saying to ourselves, look how much progress we've made. Isn't that great? Like when we go to see the movie Selma and we see police beating protesters on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, we go, oh my God, isn't it nice that that doesn't happen anymore? Okay, never mind. Right? But we get very wrapped up into that idea that that was then and this is now and those were the bad old days and oh my God, I'm so glad that doesn't happen, or at least not as often, and it's not as vicious and it's not as brutal. But the problem is that even though racism may change and shapeshift in the way that it presents, it doesn't mean that it's gone away. And when we're looking backward and we're looking for one particular kind of racism and we expect that it will express itself in the same way in every generation, we're missing a much bigger picture, right? And in this particular case, we're forgetting that there's an awful lot of work to be done. I mean, commemoration in this regard is sort of like taking a road trip with your parents from Maine to San Diego, right? And so if you're taking a road trip from Maine to San Diego, you get to Kansas and the parents up in the front seat are like, damn, look how far we've come. This is amazing. But the kids in the back seat, what are they saying? They're like, are we there yet? Are we there yet? When the hell are we going to be in San Diego? This is taking too damn long, right? The children are not impressed by your commemoration. The children are not impressed by your backward-looking nostalgia, because young people don't have anything about which to be nostalgic. They have only their future ahead of them, and they want to know what you stand for now. See? But we're looking backward, and we're not even paying attention to the fact that all of those victories that we had, there's a lot of things they didn't touch, right? And even the things that they did touch are only partial victories that are now in the process of being taken back. So we know that it's been, 61 years this year, so 60 years ago last year, that the Brown v. Board of Education decision was handed down, technically eliminating separate but unequal schooling. And yet, what do we also know? We know that Black and Latino children in this country are 10 to 12 times more likely than white children to be in concentrated poverty schools. We know that children of color are twice as likely to be taught by the least experienced teachers, right? Half as likely to be taught by the most experienced teachers. So even though we technically got rid of formal, separate, but unequal, white folks still having more access to the best instruction. People of color half as likely to have access to and be placed in honors and advanced placement classes as white students are. So on the one hand, we have a victory, but it's clearly quite imperfect, quite incomplete. By the same token, we have a Civil Rights Act of 1964 that we commemorate a half century ago, just last year, and yet What does that law do? Well, it technically prohibits discrimination in employment, but the best estimates we have suggest that there are probably 1 million cases still of race-based housing discrimination every single year against people of color, even when they are equally or better qualified than white folks. Right? So that's happening with the law in place. Right? We know that people of color are far more likely to be unemployed even when they have the same or better qualifications. You can look at black folks, Latino folk, Asian folk, and white folk, all of whom have college degrees. So now we're controlling for level of education. You can look at those folks with the same education. Black folk with a degree almost twice as likely as white folks with a degree to be unemployed. And doesn't matter what their major was. In any department, almost twice as likely to be out of work. Latino folk with a degree, 50% more likely than comparable white folk to be out of work. Indigenous folk with a degree, 2/3 more likely than comparable white folk to be out of work. Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders with a degree, 25 to 30% more likely than comparable white folk to be out of work, even with the same qualifications. So that's going on, and we have laws in place that technically should prevent the kinds of discrimination that help bring those numbers about, and yet it's still happening. So just like any law you pass, we got laws against armed robbery, still happens. We got laws against carjacking. Somebody's going to get their car taken tonight, right? We got laws against all kinds of things. Doesn't mean that that law will never be broken. By the same token, we have a Voting Rights Act, and yet we have a Supreme Court that's attempting to chip away at that. Even as we commemorate the victory, what are they doing? They're saying, well, we don't need to really oversee those states and localities that have a history of racism. We don't need to do that anymore. They're good now. Right? And the reason they said that, the reason that Justice Roberts said that, he said, look, black folks are voting in higher numbers than ever in Mississippi. In fact, in places like Mississippi, the black turnout is actually higher than the white turnout. So we don't need to oversee Mississippi's election process any longer. To which Justice Ginsburg brilliantly replied, that's sort of like being outside in a rainstorm with an umbrella, not getting wet, and deciding that therefore you no longer need the umbrella. The umbrella is why you didn't get wet. Get rid of the umbrella, you will probably not stay dry. By the same token, if you get rid of the oversight of those areas with a history of racial discrimination, the odds are pretty good they may revert. The only reason they haven't, the only reason they've made progress is precisely because you have this umbrella called the law. So even in areas where we have laws in place, we see people trying to chip away at those laws. We have states trying to pass photo identification requirements for voting under the pretext of stopping fraud. Because, you know, if you don't have a photo ID, you're going to go vote 5 times. That's what you're going to do. Because voter fraud is just a huge problem in America. First of all, just to put aside the numbers, and I'll get to those in a second, do you have any idea how stupid this argument is? Anybody know what the punishment for voter fraud, electoral fraud, it's like a $10,000 fine and like 2 years in prison. Who is going to risk that just to vote twice? Like, when was the last time there was an election that was a tie and your second vote was going to be the thing that broke the tie? Right? So why would you, like, your dude's not going to win just because you voted a couple of times. Elections are not that tight. Even for like student council in the 8th grade, they're not that tight. So what is the argument? Like, who's going to do that? Well, we know very few do. In the last 15 years, there are only 31 cases that have been able to be documented for in-person voter fraud. 31 cases in 15 years. This isn't about stopping fraud, right? It's about keeping certain people from voting, because the folks who are less likely to have photo ID are poor, because they're less likely to drive, less likely to have a bank account, things for which you might need a photo ID. And if you can keep lower income folks from voting, especially lower income folks of color, all the better in the eyes of some, right? This isn't about fraud. They're trying to shut down early voting. What's that got to do with fraud? Early voting, right, where you can vote like a week to 2 weeks before the election, which is really helpful if you work like a certain shift and don't have flexibility on the job that you can get off from work. A lot of folks, particularly working class people, don't have the luxury of being able to get off on election day and go vote. So you give them a little extra time and they vote, and there's no evidence of fraud in that at all. No one's even tried to present any, but they're trying to shut that down. Why? Who's voting early? Disproportionately working class folks and people of color. That's who. So it's transparent what their reasons are. They don't want students to be able to use your photo IDs from college, right? So they say it's about stopping fraud, but they don't even want your photo ID as a student. That doesn't count. You know why? Because they say, oh, students will fake that. Yeah, because I remember when I was 19 thinking, you know what? I need a fake ID. And you know why? So I can commit voter fraud. That's why. Hell, I ran a fake ID business when I was in college, making them for people, and no one ever came to me at election time saying, really, I need this stack. Can you get this done quick? I got to go to the polls. That was not what was on their mind. It was not what was on mine. This isn't about fraud. It's about keeping certain people from voting and letting others vote, because even though they don't want students to use your photo ID because they know how young people have been trending in the last couple of elections, they don't have any problem with you using your gun registration license as a workable legal ID. Yeah, because nobody would fake that shit. Nobody would ever try to like get a fake ID to get a gun illegally in America. That's absurd, right? Everybody that wants a gun goes about it the law-abiding way in America. We know that, right? So this is what happens. You've got laws in place and this stuff is happening anyway, right? The road ahead needs to be looked at. The road behind is not sufficient. We got a Fair Housing Act, but we have lowball estimate 2 million cases, high estimate 4 million. Let's just take the low end, just for the hell of it. 2 million cases a year, according to academic studies that have been done on housing discrimination. 2 million times a year, folks of color are being discriminated against when looking to rent a place or buy a place, given higher interest rates, told that there are no apartments available when they really are available, being made to put down extra deposit money, differential treatment relative to white folks. It happens about a third of the time, according to the research, when folks of color are looking for a place to live. Doesn't happen every time, but 1/3 of the time still translates to like at least 2 million instances. That's with a Fair Housing Act in place. Now, think about what those victories didn't even touch, because that's the stuff it did touch. It touched education, it touched voting, it touched employment, and it touched housing, and we still got issues there, but what didn't it touch? It did nothing about the criminal justice system, right? It did nothing at all about, and that's not meant as a criticism of the movement, by the way. I'm not saying that to suggest that that was a flaw or a weakness. They dealt with what was in front of them, and I understand that strategically. But we have to understand we have a movement that won all of those victories that we're still having to refight, and in this particular area, nothing was done really at all, and that's why we have so many huge problems, maybe bigger than anywhere else in our justice system. See, in 1964, at the time the Civil Rights Act was passed, 2/3 of all the people locked up in this country were white, and 1/3 were people of color. By 1994, and still today, 21 years later, 2/3 now of all people locked up are black and brown, and only 1/3 are white. Now, there are only two possible explanations for this, right? Theory number one, sometime around 1965, white people woke up from a deep criminal slumber, looked around and said, oh my God, we have been totally robbing and raping and killing and stealing. We're filling up these jails with we gotta stop, we gotta get our shit together. We're out of control, we're horrible people, my goodness. We gotta shape up and fly right. We gotta stop all this crime. And then black folks, this is still theory number one, but it's a little like sub-point, codicil, little asterisk, little thing. Then black folks apparently heard the news that we were retiring from the criminal business, and they were like, well now hell, if they're not gonna do it, we'll go in there and do it, because somebody has to do crime, might as well be us. That's theory number one. White folks shaped up, black folks went nuts and started committing more crime than ever. That, of course, is not real, and any criminologist will tell you it's not real, which brings us to theory two, and that is that even though the share of crime done by whites as a share of all crime didn't really change, even though the share of crime done by blacks didn't really change as a share of all crime. Now, the share of crime done by Latino folk did go up because the population of Latino folk went up, but that does not even remotely explain the shift from 2/3 incarcerated white to 2/3 incarcerated black and brown. So the only remaining theory then is that in spite of the fact that there wasn't really a shift in terms of who does crime, the resources of the justice system post-1964 were deployed disproportionately and egregiously so against certain communities and not others. And I would suggest to you there are lots of ways in which this happened, the first and foremost being with regard to the so-called war on drugs. And I say so-called because if we learn nothing else about this thing we call the war on drugs, let us at least learn this. It is not about drugs. And there's a reason that we know it's not about drugs. There's a very obvious reason that I know it's not about drugs. If the war on drugs were about drugs, I'm not really sure who would be giving this talk to you today, but I am really damn confident it would not be me, because I don't think they let you Skype in lectures from prison, and that is where I would be if the war on drugs were really about illegal narcotics. And I can admit that now because the statute of limitations has expired on this shit, so. Can't do nothing to me now. I don't do that anymore. I got asthma. My asthma came back. I can't do that. Can't do it anymore. Can't do it anymore. But I did, and I can tell you that if the war on drugs had been about that, hell, I worked in public housing projects in New Orleans for 15 months in the mid-1990s, at a time when they were supposedly the worst, most crime and drug infested in America. And I saw fewer drugs in the whole 15 months that I was in public housing projects in New Orleans than I saw on a typical Saturday night in my dorm room freshman year of college, right? So the war on drugs isn't about drugs. It's about controlling certain populations. The data tells us, for instance, that white folks use drugs at the same rate as black folks, and we use them more than Latino folk. But who are the folks getting arrested, right? White folks sell drugs at the same rate as black and Latino folk, contrary to popular belief. Use them, possess them, and sell them at equal or higher rates. And yet it's people of color being disproportionately arrested, prosecuted, and incarcerated 5 to 9 times, depending on which state. 5 to 9 times more likely to be incarcerated for a drug offense if you're black or brown than if you're white. Has nothing to do with drugs themselves. In fact, a couple months ago, I did this article, some of you may have seen it, about 6 weeks ago, I guess, where I was curious. I wanted to know what the actual sort of quotient of advantage and disadvantage is in the drug war. Like, in other words, I wanted to find out, how many more people of color are arrested than would be if this system were fair? And how many fewer white folks are arrested than would be if the system were fair? Because I was curious. So I got the numbers, right? I started looking at the FBI numbers for drug arrests, and you can get those numbers, and I was going to then compare them to the drug usage rate numbers, right, and then figure out how many white folks and how many black folks, let's say in a given year, use drugs and therefore possess drugs and would be subject to potential arrest. Because then you can compare these numbers. You can look at what the usage rates are, you can look at what the arrest numbers are, and you can figure out what the difference is, relative to what it would be in a fair system. So when I crunched those numbers, what I discovered was that at the very least, every single year in this country, there are 166,000 more black folks who are arrested than would be arrested if arrest rates mirrored usage and possession rates, right? In other words, if people were arrested in proportion to their likelihood of breaking a drug law, there would be 166,000 fewer black folks getting arrested every year and 166,000 more white folks getting arrested every year. Now, I want you to think about that for a minute, and then I want you to start multiplying it in your head over, let's say, a 10-year period. War on drugs has been going on for 25 years. In some regards, you might say it's been going on for 40, but in its current iteration, let's just look at it in the last decade. Think about what that means. If 1.6 million more white people had an arrest record in the last 10 years, and if 1.6 million fewer black people did, think about what that would mean in terms of who is in our jails and prisons and who isn't. What it would mean in terms of who's able to find a job and who isn't. Because remember, you get a record, you're going to have a hell of a time finding work. Right? What would it mean in terms of your ability to access student loans? Because you're not going to get student loans if you have a drug arrest record either. What would it mean in terms of your ability to access various government benefits, right? Which can also be cut off if you have a drug arrest record. Think about that. Over a 10-year period, a shift of 3.2 million people in or out of the system. 1.6 million fewer blacks in the system, 1.6 million more whites in the system. The whole country would look different. Right, now multiply that over the course of the 25-year war on drugs. Now we're talking about huge numbers, right? Let me just put it this way. If that had happened, the war on drugs would have been called off. That's what I know. Because white moms and dads ain't gonna let our babies go to prison in numbers like that. We're gonna call shit on that and we're gonna put an end to it. That's what would happen, right? But people of color don't have the power to do that in this country. And so their young children can be sent off to jail for the stuff that we do at the very same or greater rates. That is something the Civil Rights Act doesn't touch, right? And that's not meant as a criticism of the act. It's just to say, while we're looking back and commemorating, we have to continue to look ahead and realize that we got all this other stuff right in front of us, staring at us, obviously creating a problem. I mean, we live in a country right now where there's some white men getting ready to get rich selling weed in Colorado and in this state and in Oregon, right? Where it's going to be legalized or has already been legalized. All you got to do is get an occupational license and set up a storefront, right? And then they'll tax it and you can be a millionaire, right? And we got black folks in this state and brown folk in this state and in Colorado and in Oregon who are doing time for selling the same stuff but making the mistake of selling it on the street without an occupational license. Now you tell me how that's fair. If white men are able to get rich selling weed in this state or Colorado or Oregon, then every black and brown body that's locked up right now in those states for that same crime should be turned out right now, let out of jail, let out of prison. I mean, white folks, we just flaunt our drug stuff, man. And by the way, I support legalization. I'm not even like against it. I'm just saying, let's just be clear about who's gonna win and who's gonna lose on this thing, right? Same thing, we flaunt this. I mean, let me just spend a few seconds on this. I find it fascinating. White folks, we just flaunt our drug use and we know we're not going to prison. We know, like every April 20th, because 420 is, weed speak, right? So every April 20th on college campuses all around this country, I don't think y'all do this, but now I'm telling you, somebody will probably organize this shit. There are campuses all around this country. UC Boulder is one of them. UC Santa Cruz is another one, right? Where they have 420 smoke out. What is that? Oh, it's a big party where you bring all your weed and all your bongs out into the quad and get high in public. White folks print t-shirts for this shit, right? Take out advertisements in the newspaper for this stuff. Oh yeah, we're gonna get high, really high. We're gonna bring all our paraphernalia and pounds and pounds and pounds of weed, and y'all aren't gonna arrest us. And sure enough, they never get arrested. Black folks don't even go near these events, right? You will not see a black person at any of these events, and Bob Marley on some white dude's t-shirt does not count. You will not see black folks even going near this, because they know the minute they walk in, somebody's going to get arrested and it's going to be them, right? 420 smoke out, just high as a kite in front of God and nobody's getting arrested, right? People of color would not even try this. There were 2 black dudes on my whole freshman year at Tulane when I was in college. One of them got high, one of them didn't, but even the one that got high didn't even want to be within 30 yards of us, right? When we were getting high, like there was part of him really wanted to, then he was like, no. Nope, not even gonna go near you, because I'll go to jail, you'll go to rehab. You'll be back next year, my mama will kill me. So I can't even get high. And then he'd look at us because he was like, can't y'all just roll a joint? But see, we couldn't just roll a joint, because that's not what we do. We had to have technology involved. We had to have a bong that was 3 damn feet, right? And then that wasn't enough chamber to get you high. So then we took a gas mask and we attached the damn gas mask to the 3-foot bong. I don't mean to give y'all drug ideas, because first of all the white folks already know this. You already have this in your closet. But take the gas mask and put it on there, because now you need 4 feet of chamber to really get you high. Black dude was like, I've got to get the hell away from you people. You just can't even see, privileged people, we like to really go big. Like when you have privilege, you're just like, I'm not getting arrested, so I might as well just smoke a lot, right? That's what privilege is, right? It's knowing that you can get away with that stuff. It's knowing that you have the luxury of not being viewed as a deviant, as a criminal, as a pathological individual who needs to be controlled. So we can look back and commemorate our victories, but until we deal with that, until we deal with that very real inequity, we're not gonna make it very far. Now there's another piece I need to say, and this has to do with another aspect of the criminal justice system that we've been talking about a lot lately. We need to spend some time on this. The way in which black and brown communities are policed in this country has got to change. And it has to change for the sake not only of those folks who are marginalized and I would say oppressed by the way in which that policing so often operates, but for the good of the country as a whole. Because what we see in the last several months, and it's not like it was really new, but it's been foisted into our consciousness perhaps in a new way since Ferguson and since many other cases. We have case after case after case. We know there are, even according to the very incomplete FBI data on this, they don't keep very good data on unarmed people killed by police, but even the incomplete data that we have suggests that about twice a week in this country, someone who is African American, male or female, not all males, also females, and not all black, by the way, Latino folk, indigenous brother out in New Mexico that was killed in Albuquerque just about 6 weeks ago. So it happens to folk of color across the board, and sometimes it even happens to working class white folks. I should point that out, because the system of policing and law enforcement has a class bias as well, even though most of the cops are working class. It's interesting to sort of internalize that notion that poor people and working class, struggling people of all colors need to be controlled. So it's not just race, it's also a class element to that. But in the last several months, we've been seeing the racial element up close. And every time it happens, this is so important for us to talk about, there's this big racial divide about how we see stuff, right? And you can hear it every time, right? One of these things happen, black and brown folks get angry, and some white folks do too. and act in solidarity with black and brown folk. But every time there's a huge racial divide with the majority of white Americans, incident after incident after incident, saying, well, now what did they do? They must have done something to provoke the cop. They must have done something to justify being shot, because we so want to believe that. Let's talk about some of these cases, shall we? What did Eric Garner do in Staten Island other than be black? Because when they choked the life out of him, an officer who had 3 previous civil rights complaints, right, and who was not indicted after the chokehold that killed Eric Garner, it cut off blood to his jugular vein. Actually, the NYPD police union says it wasn't really a chokehold because it didn't keep him from being able to breathe like he said, but it did shut off blood flow. So it's sort of a distinction without a difference. When you compress someone's jugular, the blood that has gone to your head is unable to leave your head and circulate throughout your body, and you will die. And that's what happened. What did Eric Garner do to bring that upon himself exactly, other than be black? And I don't mean that hyperbolically, I mean it seriously, because what did he do? Well, the only thing they accused him of doing, you can watch the video, he makes no threatening motions, he doesn't swing or kick or do anything to these officers. He was accused of selling loose cigarettes on the street. That was the only accusation of any wrongdoing. Couple of points worth noting. Number 1, selling loose cigarettes, not a capital offense, even in Staten Island. Number 2, they didn't actually find any loose cigarettes on his body when they took him to the morgue, which means either he wasn't selling loose cigarettes, the reason for which he was supposedly confronted, or else he just had a really damn good day selling loose cigarettes before they killed him. Third, there's no video of him selling loose cigarettes, even though the videotape was rolling. No one has any evidence of this. So as far as we know, he had done nothing at all to justify even being asked a question by police. But what he did was, knowing that he had done nothing wrong, he made the mistake, apparently in the eyes of the law enforcement officers, of questioning them. He said, this ends today. Y'all are always bothering me. It stops now. I'm tired of this. Leave me alone. All of which he is legally entitled to say. Too many officers in this country seem to believe that you don't have the right to talk back to them and you don't have the right to question their authority. Let me suggest to you, maybe we need to start paying for these officers to go to law school. I'll be happy to do it so they can learn the Constitution, because the reality is you can say any damn thing you want to a cop. I don't recommend it. And particularly if you're a person of color, don't do this. I'm just saying you have a right to. Supreme Court decision from over 65 years ago or 70 years ago said you have the right to call a cop a fascist to his face, and he can do nothing legally to you, right? So saying this ends today, y'all are always bothering me, leave me alone, that doesn't even rise to fascist, right? That doesn't even rise to any kind of anger or slur. He had the right to say that. But in the eyes of law enforcement, when you disrespect their authority, now apparently I get to choke you. So what did Eric Garner do? He did nothing, but his killer was not indicted. And there were a lot of white folks that were upset, but there was still a big racial divide where white folks were far more likely to see danger in Eric Garner because he was big, right? Even though he didn't do anything to hurt that officer. What did Tamir Rice, 12-year-old child in Cleveland, do other than be black and playing with a toy gun in a public park? A toy gun. Something 12-year-old children do all the time. In a state that is an open carry state where you can walk around with a real gun, with real bullets legally, but you can't be black in a park with a toy gun and not be considered a threat, right? So he's there in the park playing with the gun. Somebody calls it in. Hey, there's somebody in the park. You know, I think he's a kid. I think it's a toy. Don't freak out, but you just might want to go check it out. They go out there. The cops roll up. They lied and said that they told Tamir Rice to drop his weapon, which they didn't know was a toy, right? Told him to drop it 3 times, and instead of dropping it, he pointed it at them. See, these cops didn't know there was a video, right? So they lied, figured they could get away with it. In fact, the video demonstrates that they didn't have time to tell him even once to drop this toy. They pulled up, and within 1.5 to 2 seconds, Tamir Rice had already been shot. He never pulled the gun out of his waistband to point it at anybody. He did no such thing, and they killed him anyway. And when his sister tried to run to him to offer him some comfort in his last dying moments, they grabbed her and they threw her in the back of the squad car and wouldn't let her see him. And he sat there and bled out on the pavement as they proceeded to render no medical attention to him. Now, we don't know if that officer is going to be indicted. That one is still up in the air. One thing is worth noting. This officer was actually judged emotionally unfit to be a cop 1.5 years earlier in a suburb outside of Cleveland. But apparently being emotionally unstable to be an officer in one community is not a disqualifier for the Cleveland Police Department. So what did Tamir Rice do, you see, other than be black? in a state, again, where you can carry real guns. Hell, when you get done today, go back to your room or to your apartment, wherever, and Google white men, guns, and Target. And watch the pictures pop up of white dudes in Ohio and every state in the country going into the Target, going into the Walmart, going into whatever big box store with a damn AR-15 on their shoulder. Because you can't go shopping without a weapon. Apparently, white dudes are like, I'm going to Target with a gun because I can. Because it's my Second Amendment right. I'm walking everywhere. I'm going to the Chipotle with a gun. They did that. They went to Chipotle with some assault rifles. The hell you need an assault rifle in Chipotle for? I know they ran out of carnitas. They'll get that shit back. Bringing a gun isn't going to get the pork back. Right? There was a recall or something. The gun's not going to help. Why you got to take a gun? White folks are rolling up into these stores with weapons of real destruction, with real bullets. No one's shooting them. No one's tasing them. No one sees them threatening. But now John Crawford, outside of Akron last year, 21-year-old black male on the phone with his girlfriend, right? Walking around the store, picks up an air rifle sold at Walmart that didn't happen to be in the box. It was just laying out on the shelf. He picked it up. He was just walking around. He was just, maybe he was going to buy it. Maybe he was just playing with it. I don't know. But he's just walking around. He's sort of swinging it. He's talking to his girlfriend. He's leaning on it at one point. White dude sees him, calls the police. Oh, my God, black guy with an assault rifle in the Walmart. He's pointing it at people. Once again, he lied. He didn't know there was a video. Right? The video makes it very clear he didn't point it at anybody. There was hardly anyone even around him. A couple families walked by him, pointed at them, and they didn't look afraid. They were shopping. He was shopping. He's on the phone. Nobody seemed to care, but this one white dude who calls up says, black dude, assault rifle. He's got an afro. Okay, see, first of all, it wasn't an afro. It was twist. So let's get your black hair straight. Let's get the black hair straight, please, because dude's going to get a totally different black man killed now. There's a black dude on aisle 7 with an afro, doesn't even know he's going to get shot now. See, white folks, if you're going to be racist, just be like a reasonably well-informed racist about at least black hair, and try to get informed without touching black hair. Also, let's just say that, like, don't go ask if you can touch it. Don't touch black women's hair. Ask questions. Don't do that. Google that shit. You can find out all you need to know. You don't have to touch it. So John Crawford now on the phone, not pointing the weapon, calls the cops. The cops roll in like it's a war zone. They come around the corner. They say, because see, they didn't know the video's rolling, right? They didn't know there was a video. They say that they told him to drop the weapon, and he didn't, and he pointed it at them. Now you look at the tape, right? It didn't happen. As soon as they turned the corner, they opened fire. They didn't have time to tell him to drop anything. He certainly didn't point the weapon at them, right? They shoot at him. I don't know if they hit him the first time. He falls, and then he gets back up because he's stunned, because you would be too. That's so out of context. Like, wait, what's happening? Someone is shooting at the Walmart. That's weird. So he stands back up, moves into the aisle to see what's going on. He doesn't have the weapon in his hands. It's 4 feet in front of him in the aisle where he dropped it when they opened fire on him. But now he's back in the aisle. He's standing up. The officer shoots him 4 more times. Now he's dead. And that officer is not indicted. I think it's interesting that that officer is the only officer in the history of that suburban Akron police department ever to kill someone in the line of duty. And that was the second time he had done it, right? Sure, that's a complete coincidence, right? But every single time one of these happens, folks want to try to rationalize it. The police union in Cleveland tried to rationalize the shooting of Tamir Rice. The folks in Akron did the same thing with John Crawford. But what about Mike Brown? Let's talk about that one, because here is a real Rorschach test, the ink blot of American race relations and understanding, right? Because we all think we know what happened, right? And a lot of white folks, according to the available survey data, a lot of white folks really convinced that Officer Darren Wilson had no choice but to shoot Mike Brown. Mike Brown was charging at him. How do we know that Mike Brown was charging at him? Because Darren Wilson says so. Oh, and there was a witness who confirmed it. Oh, you might have heard about this witness. Sean Hannity spent a week talking about her, right? Witness number 40 to the grand jury. Witness number 40 who said she was there and that Mike Brown charged Darren Wilson like a bull. She is the only witness who said that, by the way. 16 out of 29 witnesses said that Mike Brown was in the process of raising his hands as if to surrender. And that doesn't mean they're right. Their memories could be wrong, but that's why we have trials in this country. That's why grand juries, when you have 16 witnesses that say a crime might have happened, you're supposed to have a trial. That's what happens, and then we can cross-examine those witnesses. And you know what? It might turn out that they couldn't have gotten a conviction, but we don't even get to have a shot at that because we decide that witness number 40 is more credible than the 16 witnesses who said quite the opposite. But what do we know now about witness number 40 who says that Darren Wilson was being charged by Mike Brown like a bull? Well, here's one thing we know. She actually wasn't there. She lied. about being there. We know that now. It's been revealed that she actually was an overt racist who the day after the killing of Mike Brown went on her Facebook page and started posting all kinds of racist, hateful comments about the black community in Ferguson. Not just Mike Brown, but the whole community, praising Darren Wilson, encouraging people to give money to his legal defense fund. And she decided at some point in the following few days that she would sweeten the deal by claiming retroactively, oh yeah, I had been there and this is what I saw. She was trying to help Darren Wilson's case. Turns out she wasn't there at all. The only witness who says Mike Brown charged her like a bull is a liar and a bigot. And here's the real kicker. The prosecutor who presented the case to the grand jury now publicly has acknowledged that he knew she was lying. And he still let her testify anyway. Now that's called something in the legal parlance. It's called suborning perjury. It's something for which an individual should lose their law license and probably go to jail. But that's not going to happen. He purposely allowed someone he knew was lying to testify because he didn't want to prosecute this officer. He believed the story of the officer even though there's no other witness but this phony one who actually confirms his version of events. And so what does that tell us about race? Because see, when the survey data comes out, white folks were so quick to, and Sean Hannity hadn't apologized for hyping that phony witness. He hasn't retracted it. He hadn't said, oh, my bad, I made a mistake. Oh, no. They still going with that Witness 40 story, right? But here's what's really interesting about it. And look, I don't know what happened between Darren Wilson and Mike Brown. I wasn't there. I can't claim for sure that I know. I don't know. I wasn't there. That's why we have trials. That's the point I'm trying to make. I'm not saying that I know for a fact that this was just cold-blooded murder. I don't know. That's why we have a fact-finding process in trial where we get to cross-examine everyone, including the officer, right? Including the other witnesses who were supporting Mike Brown, right? But what I do know is this. I just want us to play a game because this, to me, says a lot about how quickly we believe anti-black stereotypes, how quick we can be to believe them. Right? Even when there's not a lot of logic to it. So let's think about the story for a minute that Darren Wilson told, right? And let's consider it in the light most favorable to Officer Wilson, just for the fun of it, right? Let's do that. Let's try to give him the benefit of the doubt and look at the evidence in the light most favorable to him. What did Darren Wilson say? Even without, witness number 40, Darren Wilson says, oh, I was being charged. He was running at me. I had no choice but to shoot. Okay, so here's what Darren Wilson says. He says he drove up and saw Mike Brown and his friend walking in the middle of the street. And according to Darren Wilson, he said very politely to them, gentlemen, would you please get up on the curb? Yes, I'm exactly sure that's how the police officer spoke to these two young black men. Gentlemen, may I impart upon you the need to get upon the raised sidewalk? I'm sure that's exactly how he said it because that is always how police officers interact with young black men in Ferguson, Missouri. I mean, that's just obvious, right? But again, we're considering it in the light most favorable, so excuse my cynicism. So let's just pretend that that's exactly how he said it, and then let's pretend that Mike Brown and his friend basically told, the cop to screw off, which is what he says. And then, Darren Wilson starts to drive away, and then he's like, to hell with that, and he pulls back. This is his version. And he pulls very close to Mike Brown and rolls down his window, at which point, according to Officer Wilson, Mike Brown just punches him through the window. Just out of the blue, just punches him in the face through the window. Okay, before we consider this in the light most favorable to Darren Wilson, because I'm totally coming back to that, but can we just ask ourselves a very simple question? Like, do you think any black man in America, when a cop rolls up, is just gonna be like, I don't know, what the hell, let me just hit him? Like, how does that even make sense? Dude has got a car and a weapon. He is a cop, and you're a black man in Ferguson, Missouri, who has a history of racism toward the community. You really think this dude's like, I don't know, maybe it's my lucky day. I'll just hit him in the face and run. And I'm sure I can get away. I'm sure they won't arrest me. I'm sure they won't shoot me. Oh, what the hell? Let me just give it a shot. I got nothing else going on today. Like, does anybody actually think that makes any sense at all? Okay, let's say you do. Let's say you believe it. Maybe it happened. I don't know. Right? So let's just pretend, again, evidence in the light most favorable to Officer Wilson, Mike Brown punches him. Well, now that is a horrible crime. And if that happened, Mike Brown should be arrested for that. Not shot for that, but arrested for that. I get it. Right? But now here's where the story really gets difficult to swallow, right? Because here's what Darren Wilson says. He says now he's afraid for his life, so he starts to pull his gun and it discharges, and it's not real clear whether it discharged on purpose or whether it was accidental or what it was. But anyway, we know the gun goes off and we know it hits Mike Brown in the hand. This is undisputed, right? Officer Wilson says this. So he shoots Mike Brown in the hand, at which point Mike Brown now knows a couple of things for sure. Number one, this officer does indeed have a weapon, just in case he didn't know that. Number two, it has bullets in it. And number 3, he's willing to shoot me. Now keep that in mind, because that's going to be really important here in a second. So now Mike Brown does the logical thing. You've just been shot. What do? You're afraid. You're afraid for your life. You start running. You don't want to get shot again, and you don't want to get arrested. And now, especially if you hit the dude, you're thinking, oh, I might have screwed up. So now Mike Brown decides he's going to run. Makes sense. Very rational. You would do that. So now Mike Brown starts to run away. Dude is like 6'5", 380 or something. I don't think he can cover. He's not like Flash Gordon. Like, he doesn't do like a 4-second 40, right? Not even close, right? So he starts running. He's running. And he gets 35 yards away, over 100 feet away, right? According to the measurements that were done afterward. He's 35 yards out. And according to Darren Wilson, it is at that moment when Mike Brown, having rationally sought to get away from the bullets, again, a rational act by a rational human being, now all of a sudden, Mike Brown, 35 yards out, he just stops and he's basically like, screw it. I'm just going to turn around and charge his ass. I'm sure that'll work out well, right? Like, does that make any sense at all? Can we just, like, all of a sudden I'm running, I'm afraid he's going to shoot me. Oh, to hell with that. I'm no punk. I'm going to charge his ass 35 yards. I'm going to cover, and I'm sure that I can cover 35 yards before he can pull the trigger, because I'm fast like that. I'm 380 pounds and 6'5". I'm sure that maybe he's like Barney Fife on the Andy Griffith Show. He only has 1 bullet. Right? That's an old reference. The young folks are like, what the hell? It's Nick at Night, Nick at Night, Nick at Night. Check that shit out. The older folks know what I'm talking about, right? It's as if you would have to believe Mike Brown thinks the laws of physics don't apply to his body. Right? Like, I got shot that one time, but this right here, this is like an invisibility cloak. He can't hit me anywhere in here. You would have to believe that Mike Brown is both the most rational and irrational person on the planet in the same 10-second time span. Because he was rational enough to run away, that's a very rational thing to do, and then he's completely irrational to think that he can knock the dude down before he shoots him again. That's absurd. The only way that anybody can believe that is because we are so ready to believe the worst about black men in this country that if somebody says they look demonic, which is what the officer said, if someone like Witness 40 says that charge the officer like a bull, we believe that. That's why before this case even got adjudicated at the grand jury, folks were sending around those pictures on Facebook and Snapchat and Instagram of what they thought was Mike Brown. They found this picture of some black dude on the internet that wasn't Mike Brown. But he was bald, whatever, sort of looked a little bit like Mike Brown, I suppose, if Mike Brown were, younger and shorter and lighter. And decided to circulate the picture of this black dude holding a gun, pointing it at a camera with a stack of bills and I think some weed, right? And they were sending it around saying, here's your gentle giant, Mike Brown. Here's the real Mike Brown. And it wasn't him at all. But people circulated that picture. It went around hundreds of thousands of times, right? And it went around because people found it possible to believe that. What does that say about our country 50 years after those victories that we're commemorating, that we're still having to grapple with folks that so readily want to believe the worst about black men and believe these stories that are used to justify police violence? And that's not to say that all police are violent in that fashion. It is to say that we need communities to have some say-so about who's going to police them. That's what we need. We need communities that have the right to veto certain folk. Because if you don't live in the community, you damn well better know some people in the community. You better have some relationships in the community. You better be prepared to come and meet folks in the community. And you certainly ought not be allowed to police in a place that you consider a bad community, which is what Darren Wilson said about Ferguson in the grand jury. He said, everybody knows this is a bad community. The hell are you doing policing people in a place that you think is bad? How are you going to treat them fairly like human beings? You're not. See? So it isn't about good cops, bad cops. We know just like with teachers or employers or whatever it is, there's good and bad in every possible occupational group. But the problem is when cops are bad, folks die, right? It's different than if like the nurse is bad. I mean, you could die there too, but you probably just get a shot in a bad place, no big deal. You'll probably survive it, right? If your teacher is bad, you won't get the proper education, but you won't necessarily die. If a cop is engaged in brutality and views his community that he works in as pathological and dysfunctional, all bets are off and no one is safe, see? And the civil rights laws don't do anything about that. So that's the second problem. We look backward, we're not looking forward. One more thing before I'm done and take some questions. The third problem with commemoration is that sometimes the commemoration, the road that you're on, what you're commemorating, ends up being one of those roundabouts in the middle of the street. And if you're not careful, you headed right back where you were, right? So that's what we were talking about with trying to take back the victories of the Voting Rights Act. We're seeing the same thing with immigration, right? What we're doing right now is repeating our history of frankly, overtly racist and ethnically biased and culturally biased immigration laws. That's been the history of the way immigration has been used in this country. It was used against Asian folk initially in that fashion, right? It was used against certain European ethnics as well in that fashion, who then later on graduated into the group known as the white race, right? And it is now being used against brown folks south of this artificial border that exists in our country. Artificial because it's a border that only exists. God didn't make that border. Nature didn't make that border. A war of aggression started by this country on false pretense against Mexico created that border. And now folks wanting to come home, and we're saying you can't come home. Now, if I come into your house and put all your shit on the street, and then you want to come back to your house, who in the hell am I to tell you that you can't come back home? Not to mention, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo sort of says that there are rights that extend to the descendants of those whose land was lost, but we apparently don't believe in enforcing that treaty. Right? We don't believe in interpreting it in such a way as to require that, and we act as if this isn't about race. People swear it's not about race. Oh, it's not about race that I want to police the border. It's not racial. I don't mind them coming. I just want them coming the right way, like my ancestors. Yeah. Couple of points, okay? Couple of points. The ancestors in question, who came the right way, that is to say not breaking a law, act as if they deserve to be patted on the back for not having broken a law. But what they forget is there was no law in place to break. In other words, when those European folks decided to come here, they didn't have to violate any law. There was no law to keep them from coming. You don't get applauded and you don't get any credit for not breaking a law that didn't exist. Right? That doesn't make you special. It doesn't make you moral. And the idea that our people, this is what we say, well, first of all, it's a lie. It's not just that we want people to come legally versus quote unquote illegally. That's nonsense, because we could make that happen tomorrow. We really could. We could make it happen tomorrow. We could basically make immigration legally as easy as filling out a postcard, right? Maybe submitting some, I don't know, saliva so they can run the DNA through the Interpol or something. I'm not saying I support that, but you could. You could do that. You could make sure that they weren't wanted criminals, and pretty much, like a week later, you come in. We could make it that easy. I'm not saying we should or shouldn't. I'm saying we could do that, and that would get rid of undocumented crossing pretty much overnight. Because you telling me a family won't wait 2 weeks to fill out the post? They'll wait 2 weeks. They've been waiting a long time. Oh, really? I can come and I won't get hunted in the desert, and I won't be shot, and I won't starve in the desert? Then cool, I'll wait the 2 weeks. But no one who says, oh, I like them if they come legally, just not illegally, ever advocates making it easier to come legally. Right? Ever. So that's how we know it's not real. Or then they'll say things like, well, it's not racial. It's just, our ancestors came for principles. They came looking for freedom and liberty. And these people, they're not coming for principles. They're coming for stuff, right? They're coming for our jobs. They're coming for our welfare. They're coming for our health care because it's so generous, right? I mean, if they're really coming for health care, they're probably headed up to Canada. They're probably not going to stop anywhere near us, right? Yeah, they're coming just to take our stuff. But that's, again, false memory. Going back to what we do remember and what we don't remember. The idea that European people came here for freedom, are you kidding me? If we came here for freedom, we would have established some. But that's not what we established. And I don't just mean in terms of the way we treated indigenous people or African peoples or Chinese labor on the railroads or Mexican folk with whom we started a war. I mean the way that we treated each other. Hell, white folks were killing other white folks in Salem because they thought they were witches. They didn't pray the right way, right? So we didn't establish freedom, we established tyranny. We reestablished religious tyranny in many of the colonies. The idea we were coming for liberty and freedom must strike not just indigenous people as a joke, but any educated person as a joke, right? We came for stuff. Everybody immigrates for stuff called opportunity that they didn't have wherever it was they were. That's why nobody likes to immigrate. Nobody wants to leave where they're from. Nobody wants to pack up everything that they know and everything they've been and have to leave their country and their place of birth to go to another. I don't even like moving across town, right? We just built a new house. It's only 3 blocks from our old house. I didn't like that. 3 blocks, I didn't want to move my shit. You think people want to actually cross a border and risk death? You think folks wanted to cross that ocean and come from Europe? Not only did African folks not want to make the journey, as James Baldwin said, here's the thing, white folks have forgotten, they didn't want to come here either, right? We were the losers of our respective countries, those ancestors of ours. And I don't mean that like in a mean way, like losers. I don't mean it pejoratively. I'm just saying the obvious, right? Like the folks who got on the boat were not the winners of their respective, like if you were winning, you didn't leave. Like everybody's like, oh, my family came over on the Mayflower. Yeah, you might not want to talk about that shit because you know who was on the Mayflower? Actually, let's just say this. Guess who wasn't on the Mayflower? The king, and anybody the king knew or liked was not on the Mayflower. Rich English folk who were rocking it in England did not say to themselves one day like, oh, I don't know. It's been going pretty splendidly here. But I think, what the hell, let's just get on the boat, why don't we? It'll be an adventure. We'll cross the ocean. We might get a disease and die. We might get stranded at sea, our ship might sink, but it'll be fun. No, the people who got on the boat were, as James Baldwin reminded us, the people who were starving. They couldn't make it where they were. Many of them were convicts and they had nothing to lose, right? And there's no shame in that. But where the shame comes in is when we try to act like those new immigrants have anything different about them than what our ancestors had. There's no difference. We were coming for opportunity that we could not access in our country of origin, as are they. And when we fail to see us in them and they in us, that is when we create systems and policies of oppression that have nothing to do with strengthening this country, everything to do with marginalizing those who were already marginalized and forgetting where we came from, see? As long as we continue to tell ourselves these historical lies and these myths and these fantasies about how our ancestors were always noble, and they are only coming to take things, which, by the way, that's what people say. People say things like, Mexicans are taking all the jobs. Okay, here's the thing. Once again, I don't ask a lot of racists. I don't. My intellectual threshold is incredibly low for them. However, if you're going to be a racist, you have to be consistent. That's my only rule, because here's the thing racists will say. They will say, Mexicans are taking all the jobs. And then they'll turn around and say, Mexicans are lazy and just want welfare. Okay, which is it? Because I'm pretty sure that if you took all the jobs, you don't even qualify for any welfare. And if you are on public assistance, I'm pretty sure you're not working all the jobs. You might not even be working any job, right? So at some point, I just want no moving targets with my racists. I just want you to pick a prejudice. Like either they're taking all the jobs or they're not working at all. It's actually neither of those things. But just, pick one. That's all I'm asking, because that's what it is. And I'm making fun of it to suggest that we've got to ridicule the ridiculous. These stories that we tell about folks, ourselves and others, are ridiculous. They deserve to be ridiculed. The rah-rah, absurd, blind faith, patriotic version of our history is ridiculous. It deserves to be ridiculed. The stereotypes that we have of black men and brown folks in this country generally are ridiculous and deserve to be ridiculed. And the way in which we try to justify all of this and commemorate only the good and not remember the bad doesn't do us any favors as a people and leaves us in real trouble, because we don't have a lot of time to figure this out. This isn't all fun and games. It's not an academic point either. 30 years from now, according to all the evidence, we're going to be 50% people of color and 50% white. That's just a fact, and I don't care what folks think about it. It doesn't matter. I know there's some people not happy about it. I know there's some white folks in Arizona very upset about it. I don't care. I've been to Arizona. I've seen these people. Their average age is 137 years old. So I'm fairly confident that they're probably not going to win this one. I'm just thinking time is really not on their side. So if we're prepared to do the work, if we're prepared to fight for multiracial, multicultural democracy, we can carry the day in that 30-year period and we can have a more equitable and functional space. If we don't, then I guess we won't. And what's going to happen then? If we get to that point where we're a 50-50 country and people of color are still twice as likely to be out of work, 3 times as likely to be poor, 1/20th the net worth, 9 years less life expectancy, double the rate of infant mortality, double the rate of low birth weight kids, how is that a recipe for a functioning America? I would suggest that's bad for everybody. That's not just bad for people of color. That's not good for anybody's children. And I want to close with this, because, I know what happens when we as people of the left politically say these things about our country, and we insist that we have to talk about the bad and the ugly, and we have to be honest about it. We always get accused, right, of being un-American, hating America. Rudy Giuliani says that about even someone like Barack Obama, who actually does believe in American exceptionalism. That's one of the problems, I would suggest, right? Because even though there are certain things about our country which are absolutely amazing and incredible, the idea that we're just fundamentally different than every other nation on earth, how do we, first of all, unless you've traveled to every nation on earth to even be able to objectively make that comparison, what the hell are you talking about? Most people who say that have never been out of the country, right? Like there was a guy, what's his name, Tom DeLay, used to be in Congress, and he famously said, but like the last year he was in Congress, he's been out for like 10 years now, I guess, and I think he went to prison for a minute, I don't know, anyway. But Tom DeLay's infamous comment was, why would I want to leave America? He didn't even have a passport. Why would I want to go anywhere but Texas? Right? Right? How the hell you know you're the best country if you had never been anywhere? It'd be like me saying, Nashville, where I live, is the greatest city. Have you ever left it? No, I've never been anywhere, but I looked it up on Google, and I'm sure that we're the best. Like, that just doesn't... So we get accused of hating America. We get accused of not loving the country and the people of the country. But let me ask you a question, because this narrative, it's time we flip this narrative, right? Because who are the people that really don't love this country? We really want to get down to it. Let me tell you, the people who don't love the country are the ones that are satisfied with it the way it is. The ones who don't love the country, if you think that the best we can do is black folk twice as likely to be out of work as white folk, who's given up on America? Not me, see? We're not the cynical ones. We're not the skeptical ones. We're not the ones who don't believe in the country. We believe that we can be better than that. We believe that our people are better than that. But if you're somebody that says, well, 2.5 million people under lock and key, the justice system, 7.5 million overall in jail, prison, probation, or parole, that's the best we can do. Racial profiling, what are you going to do about it? 1/20th the net worth, 9 years less life expectancy, oh well, for people of color. It seems to me that people who really detest the institutions and the society in which they live are the ones who are satisfied with its mediocrity. Right? Not those of us who insist that we can be better. Those of us who insist that we can be better, we're the ones who believe in the people of this country. We're the ones who believe in the possibility and the promise and the aspirational possibility of America. Right? Not the ones who are so cynical as to act as if we have arrived at this wonderful grand city on a hill and have nothing else to learn and no one else to learn from and nothing else to accomplish. That is real contempt. Right? If I were to be satisfied with my daughters the way they are now at 13 and 11 and insist on no more growth, that wouldn't be an act of love. That would be an act of profound hatred. That would be an act of profound contempt for my daughters. It would be a way of saying to them, you know what? Your 28-year-old self can just be like your 11-year-old self, and I'm sure it'll be fine. What kind of guidance would that be? What kind of love would that be? What kind of support would that be? That's not good parenting. And it's not good when we do it as a country, but we do it all the time. We have to insist on better. We deserve better. The people of this country, and God knows the people of this planet, deserve better from us than that. Thank you all so much for being here. I appreciate it. Thank you.